subjects of this podcast are two carved ivory figures called Okimonos. They were made in Japan in the Meiji period in the mid to late 19th century. One is of a small chicken and the other is of a figure of a bijin, meaning a beauty, holding a child with 3 chickens at her feet. The hair of the woman and the child are coloured with black pigment. Pigment has also been used to show the tiny details of the clothing. It is like the child was originally holding an object, which has been broken and lost. He may have been holding a toy, like in this okimono, which is of a similar subject. In Japanese, okimono can mean any freestanding object. They were originally made as ornaments for the butsudan, a Buddhist altar, or the tokonoma. A tokonoma is an alcove in a Japanese reception room. It is an essential item of traditional Japanese interiors used to display items for artistic appreciation. From the 18th century onwards, bronze okimono were made for the tokonoma in the form of insects, reptiles, animals, and legendary characters. An example of an okimono on display in a tokonoma can be seen in this 18th century woodcut. During the Meiji period, the function, style, subject, and material of okimonos went through a great change, reflecting the rapid westernization of Japan during this period, and its ambition to become an important industrial nation. Through these two objects we can follow the great cultural and political changes that Japan underwent in this period, and the effect that the opening of the West had upon Japan. In 1854, Japan was forced to open its ports to foreign trade after nearly 250 years of isolation under shogunate rule. The shogunate fell in 1868 and the emperor was restored to power. For the first time, Japanese culture and art was open to the West. The young emperor took the name Meiji, meaning enlightened rule. The new Meiji government introduced a rapid modernization of Japan, and the period oversaw enormous changes to Japan's political and social structure, and was responsible for the emergence of Japan as a modernized nation in the early 20th century. One of the new government's principal goals was the international recognition of Japan as an equal among civilizations. One of the methods to achieve this goal was the policy of exportation of Japan's applied arts in order to promote the image of Japan as a place of industry and craftsmanship. Japan's participation in international exhibitions allowed them to promote their country's products and to acquire the latest technological information about the West. One of the products that was used to display Japan's craftsmanship was the okimono. Before the Meiji Restoration, the Buddhist temples had employed many sculptors, but following the government's reforms, these highly skilled craftsmen sought employment in making products for exportation to the West. The okimono allowed them to maintain and display their skills. Following the international exhibitions in the West, there was a craze for all things Japanese, and Japanese objects were in great demand. These pictures show the craze for Japanism in the West, with scenes filled with desirable Japanese objects. They feature women dressed in Japanese kimono. The paintings offer a decorative and sensual experience in which Japanese women, their clothing, and the objects are offered up for aesthetic enjoyment. Interestingly, whilst Japan was rapidly modernizing, the West still desired to see depictions of old Japan. The photographs of Felice Beto, a well-known photographer, helped to create what became the dominant image of Japan as simple, rustic, and picturesque. Photographers hurriedly snapped the old way of life that was disappearing to sell to tourists in albums. They took staged and studio photographs of people in traditional clothing and performing what was perceived as traditional crafts. In 1871, Emperor Meiji prescribed Western clothing for himself, his court, and his officials. It was argued that wearing European-style clothing was essential to presenting Japan on a par with the civilized nations of the West, dissolving Japan's identification with a weak, effeminate East in need of Western guidance, thus assisting the reversal of unequal treaties. Clothing became a visual motif of the progressive values of Western civilization that Japan was adopting. Although initially encouraged by the idea that Japan was becoming like the West, Britain began to get rather uneasy as the country started to develop industrially and militarily. commentators retreated into the more comfortable fantasies of old Japan. Although many Japanese people still wore traditional clothing, it was the kimono that became a mark of Japaneseness to both Japan and the West. The kimono served as a potent visual sign of Japanese tradition. Many Westerners perceived a break with the kimono as a break with the idealized image of the pre-Meiji Japan that they had barely glimpsed, and it was feared that it would lead to a deterioration in the quality of all things Japanese that were admired in the West. The depiction of the woman and child in the okimono is similar to the staged photographs of the time. She is beautiful, her clothing is highly decorated, and her hair is coiffured. She wears the formal clothing of a apprentice geisha, or a wealthy woman from the Edo period, as indicated by her long sleeves and unwieldy long obi. The highly formal and elaborate clothing of the woman contrasts with the domestic setting that the okimono portrays, with the plain child and the chickens. This okimono, like the photographs, have a general sense of the sentimental and picturesque, an unintended orientalization of the object. This both enabled Japan to single out motifs they wanted to represent Japan's culture, whilst making the object more desirable to Western tastes. Universal subjects were chosen, and by far the most popular subjects for okimonos were people, especially bijins, craftsmen, and old men and children. The composition of the okimono can be seen in the art from before the Meiji era, such as the bijinga, beautiful person picture, that was produced in Japan from the 17th to the 19th century. The bijin wear colourful and elaborate clothing, and the example of the bijin goseku is quite similar to the okimono in the project, that of a bijin holding a child with a toy. The Japanese were noted for their somberness in dress. It seems likely that the carver has chosen a highly decorative costume to display his skill, and because of its attractiveness to the Western market, rather than according to real life, but has not departed far from Japanese artistic tradition. But how else did the West influence the okimonos? During the Meiji period, through its industrial promotion policy, the new government encouraged the manufacture of traditional Japanese goods for export in response to the huge demand in the West because of the Japonism movement. Okimonos were mostly regarded as a luxury item, and therefore meant predominantly for export. Ivy was imported from Africa and India, and okimonos were carved for re-export. Western collectors desired the figures made from ivory rather than wood because of its luxury. The need to present okimonos in European interiors prompted them to be made in larger dimensions. In addition, the wealthy Europeans who bought Japanese products were used to the patina and smooth surface of marble sculpture that decorated their interiors. The pristineness of early ivory okimonos did not lend itself to long-time preservation. This led to a new generation of carvers who produced okimonos with a golden hue, tinted with organic dyes and polished to enhance patina. The bijin and child is an example of the later style for the Western market. The okimono has the remains of the organic dye used for the bijin's hair and to highlight the carving of the pattern of the kimono. Whereas the bijin bears similarity to tourist photographs, the chicken bears more similarity to the bold line of Japanese ukiyo-e, woodblock prints. This style has more in common with the earlier okimonos, such as the sleeping cat okimono from 1806. It is small and most likely made from an offcut of ivory, and has more in common with the netsuki than the intricately carved bijin figure. In conclusion, understanding the okimono requires the understanding of this important part of the history of Japan's culture. The okimono mirrored the complexity of the Meiji period with its quest for preserving national carving traditions, sentimentalization, Orientalism, all coupled with the rapid modernization and search for national identity. At At the same time, the okimono can be viewed as the bridge between the East and the West, traditions and novelty.